We all know what the major goal of the Apollo program was: to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, basically to beat the Soviets and prove that the capitalist system was better than the communist one. But once that was done, what would happen to the hardware, the rockets, the spacecraft and technology which had been developed, not to mention the 400,000 workers that had helped build them? It would be a waste not to capitalise on the gains they had made and to make the most of the $25 billion that would have been spent. To this end, in 1965, well before the first moon landings, a program called Saturn Apollo Applications, which later became the Apollo Applications Program, was created to utilise the Apollo hardware for a range of other duties after the initial moon landings. So in this video, we'll look at what the planners thought Apollo might have gone on to do in the 1970s and how the Apollo 1 fire changed everything. This video is sponsored by Magellan TV. Magellan is a new documentary streaming service run by filmmakers that have a passion for their work. Magellan believes that spreading knowledge about the human endeavour is key, and their mission is to tell great stories and show how we got to where we are today. With over 3,000 documentaries available and with more being added all the time, and a wide selection of those being in 4K, Magellan is the place to find a huge range of documentaries ready to stream directly to your viewing device, be that fixed or mobile. To complement our video today, Magellan has a documentary about the Saturn V called The Saturn V Story, the rocket that took the men to the moon, and without it there would be no Apollo program. This is a fascinating look at how they overcame the huge technical challenges to build the most powerful machine for over 50 years until the upcoming SLS rocket for the Artemis program, Apollo's successor in returning to the moon. You can watch this and many more by getting your 1 month free trial by using the link for this special offer right at the top of the description below, and I'm sure you'll enjoy watching Magellan TV as much as I have. The Apollo Applications program was what the planners, including Wernher von Braun, hoped Apollo would lead on to once the initial moon landings had been completed. This was still an early time for space exploration, as we saw in the previous video about Skylab. We may well have gone to the moon, but we didn't really know how to live and work in space for long periods. The Apollo Applications program would take what we developed and run with it to help develop our abilities, not only to live in space, but also on the moon. In 1965, there were two possible routes depending upon how the funding would hold up. The first, Case 1 scenario, was that there would be no further Saturn Apollo hardware ordered past that of the moon missions. Even with these limitations, the Saturn Apollo office thought there would be 21 Saturn 1B launches. That's the shorter version without the first main stage, and which sat on the Milkstool launch pad and would be used for lighter loads, and 15 of the full-size Saturn V launches by the end of 1973. The second Case 2 scenario would see an extensive utilisation of Saturn Apollo capabilities, with an earlier focus on a post-Apollo national space objective, with these extra missions being interleaved with the moon landings and other missions. These would include using the fuel tank of the upper stage of a Saturn V rocket as a wet workshop. Once the fuel in the tank was spent, instead of just jettisoning it, they would vent any fuel left into space and then use the interior as a habitat and workshop. This idea would later be used for Skylab, though this was a dry workshop as it was purpose-built for the task and never used as a fuel tank in space. There were 4 planned phases to Apollo. Phase 1 was from 1969 to 71, which would land the first men on the moon and build up experience over the next 4 missions. These missions corresponded to Apollo 11 to 14. Phase 2 from 1972 to 73 would be the lunar exploration phase. These missions would stay for longer durations and bring larger payloads, including the lunar rover, and these ended up corresponding to Apollo 15 to 17. Phase 3 was penciled in for 1974 and was a lunar orbital survey mission, which was a bit like Apollo 8, but with just 2 astronauts instead of 3, and with just the command and service module without the lunar module. This would enter a polar orbit around the Moon for 28 days and observe the whole surface of the Moon with a suite of instruments including film cameras, a magnetometer, a radar altimeter, gamma ray spectrometer, and a micrometeoride collection plate in the service module. This job would eventually be done in much greater detail and for much longer by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter robotic probe starting in 2009 and is still going today. Phase 4 would be from 1975 to 76 and would be the Lunar Surface Rendezvous and Exploration phase and would consist of a dual launch mission. The first would deliver a modified Lunar Payload Module or LPM to the surface of the Moon, basically a lunar module but without the ascent engines and associated parts and fuel tanks to give it a greater payload capability, including food and scientific equipment. This would also act as a shelter for when the astronauts arrived up to 3 months later. The second part of the mission would be when the astronauts arrived and would land them near the lunar module shelter. The mission would then stay on the surface for up to 14 days. It was envisioned that over time this basic setup would evolve into a lunar base with larger shelters powered by a nuclear reactor, with long-range rovers and up to 6 men staying for up to 6 months or 180 days at a time. Another plan was a manned flypast of Venus with a Saturn V used to send a 3-man crew which would fly past in the command and service module attached to the second stage fuel tank of a Saturn 1B. Once the fuel had been used, the tank would then be used as a wet workshop where the crew would live on a return journey before separating and returning to Earth. But these Apollo application program missions were contingent on the funding, which was around $450 million per year, being supported by Congress, and to keep Congress happy, NASA had to deliver on what they had planned with no major hitches. This is where a massive spanner was thrown into the works with the Apollo 1 fire on January 27, 1967, which claimed the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee during a plugs-out test, basically a full simulation of a launch but without fuel in the rocket. This was a huge blow to Apollo and would lead to a major overhaul of the whole program, but some say that it was a blessing in disguise. The reasoning behind this was that NASA had been racing to keep to the deadline of putting a man on the Moon by the end of the 1960s, and had taken what some say were unacceptable risks to cut corners and costs. The Apollo 1 command module was an early design that relied upon a low-pressure pure oxygen environment in space to save weight and complexity compared to a nitrogen-oxygen mix more like we breathe here on Earth. The hatch door was also designed to open inwards, so when the fire took hold, the pressure in the cabin increased, making it impossible for the crew to open the door from the inside. The earlier Mercury and Gemini missions also used a pure oxygen environment, and the thinking was that because there'd been no issues there, then the same pure oxygen environment would work for Apollo, even though it was much more complicated design and the risks were considerably greater. To some in the space industry, this was an accident waiting to happen, and that if the Apollo 1 test had worked and the program had gone ahead with its original design, this kind of accident would have probably happened during a real launch with the subsequent loss of the crew and vehicle. From that standpoint, it would have been much harder, if not impossible, to try and find the root cause of the accident and could well have ended the program there and then. In fact, we still don't know exactly what triggered the fire in the command module of Apollo 1, apart from the fact that it was most likely a short circuit in a bundle of wires. One saving grace was that it happened during a test and was on the launch pad, so the command module was still intact and could be gone over in forensic detail. The fire delayed the program for 21 months, in which time there was a major redesign of the command module and other systems, and a shake-up of NASA's working practices that led to a greater emphasis on safety and fire in particular. But all of this came at the same time as the cost of the Vietnam War was spiralling upwards, and President Lyndon Johnson wanted to introduce his version of Roosevelt's New Deal called the Great Society, a set of domestic programs to quell civil unrest by eliminating poverty and racial injustice and keep within a $100 billion budget. With all these competing interests and Congress's displeasure with NASA's performance around the Apollo 1 fire, it meant it was atop of the list for budget cuts. They couldn't cut the whole program because that would renege on the promise that President Kennedy had made in 1961. But what they could do was put a halt to the post-Apollo applications program by cutting its budget from $450 million to $122 million, a slide which continued under Nixon in 1970. The scheduled Apollo 20 was cancelled and its Saturn was redesignated to launch the Skylab, which would become the focus of NASA's post-Apollo plan until the Space Shuttle, which was meant to come in service on 1979, although it eventually turned up in 1981. Further reductions came as the Lunar Orbital Survey was cancelled and the moon missions were cut short, with the cancellation of Apollo 18 and 19, leaving Apollo 17 as the sixth and last Apollo manned mission to the moon. 2 more Saturn rockets were used on the following Skylab missions and one on the Apollo-Soyuz mission, where the American Apollo Command and Service Module docked with the Soviet Soyuz capsule in 1975, and the handshake between the 2 crews seemed a fitting end to the space race, which began 18 years earlier with the launch of the Soviet Sputnik 1. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, click the bell notification, subscribe and share, and don't forget Patreon supporters get ad-free versions of the videos before they go public on YouTube.